I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History is Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium, here in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. Remember that admission to the museums is free every Sunday, and right now includes the PBS Frontline special exhibit Unresolved, which examines the federal government's effort to investigate more than 150 civil rights era cold cases under the authority of the Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Crime Act. And tune in next week for our first international History is Lunch program, when we'll be joined by historian Emma Falwell from Birmingham, England, to discuss her new book, The War on Poverty in Mississippi. Today, we are delighted to welcome Robert H. Mayer, who is the author of the just published book, In the Name of Emmett Till, How the Children of the Mississippi Freedom Struggle Showed Us Tomorrow. Robert H. Mayer holds an MA in History from Xavier University and a PhD in Curriculum and Instruction from the Pennsylvania State University. A retired social studies teacher and professor of education at Moravian College, now University, Mayer is the author of When the Children Marched, The Birmingham Civil Rights Movement, and editor of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which book won a Carter G. Woodson Award in 2005. Robert Mayer, welcome to History is Lunch.
Thank you. Thanks to you, Chris. I appreciate your inviting me to speak with everyone. I also appreciate that trove of wonderful events you left in the History is Lunch events. And thanks to everyone at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History for supporting such a dynamic and vital organization. Now, I'm grateful to be able to be here with you via Zoom, but I am saddened that I can't be in Jackson. I look forward to the time when I can return to Jackson and meet people face to face. In the meantime, for the moment, thanks to everyone for being here. I appreciate it wherever you are. And I'm going to now share I am sorry, I'm looking for okay. There we go. So I'm excited for the opportunity to talk with you about a book I wrote that was just published, just released by New South Books. The book is entitled In the Name of Emmett Till, How the Children of the Mississippi Freedom Struggle Showed Us Tomorrow. I wrote the book for a middle school young adult audience. I want them to know this story, but I am hoping the book will find its way into the hands of adults as well. My intent, my main purpose in writing this book is to introduce young readers to an amazing group of young people from Mississippi, kids who were central to the civil rights movement in Mississippi and in the nation. And yes, as readers take in the narrative of these young activists, I hope they are inspired. There's another reason I wrote this book. I hope to alter the way we all view the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. In studying the children of the Mississippi freedom struggle, we start to see the civil rights movement in a larger, and I think truer way. Now, we tend to think of the movement, or many people think of the movement, just in terms of a few charismatic leaders like Dr. King and major media events like the March on Washington or the Selma marches. Mississippi adds a unique dimension to the civil rights narrative, which in many respects stands that narrative on its head. Studying the Mississippi freedom struggle reminds us or teaches us that the civil rights movement was also a movement about what historian John Dittmer called or named or referred to as local people. The sharecroppers, the domestics, teachers, shop owners, the people on the street. Mississippi organizers worked door to door, pool hall to pool hall, to build a pantheon of freedom fighters. Organizers in the Mississippi movement saw their task as standing behind the local people, urging them to become the true movement leaders. This approach reminds me of a chant I heard in May of 2020 at a Black Lives Matter march. This is what democracy looks like. In this brief talk, I want to share some concrete instances that will both illustrate the unique nature of the civil rights movement in Mississippi and also capture a sense of how the young Mississippians who were part of the movement added to the great American project. I also hope that I leave in your narrative memory some great stories about the young Mississippi freedom fighters. Now, I need to take a step back. The first part of the title is In the Name of Emmett Till. So I need to briefly remind you of Emmett Till's narrative, and then I'll go on to explain the connection between his horrific murder and the young Mississippi activists. So, Emmett Till was, in 1955, a 14-year-old boy living in Chicago with his mother. And he begs her to allow him to travel to Mississippi, to the Delta, to spend time with his cousins and other relatives. And she begrudgingly agrees. So Emmett goes down to the Delta near Greenwood, Mississippi. And at one moment in his travels, he is sitting with his cousins in front of Bryants grocery store. And there on the left, you see a historic picture of the grocery store. On the right, you see a picture I took in 2014. It remains today unrestored. So Emmett is sitting in front of the store. He wants to go in and get some bubble gum. He goes in where he encounters Carolyn Bryant, the white wife of the owner, Roy Bryant. She's behind the cash register. Now, we don't know exactly what happened in the store, but he might have put the money he was paying directly in her hands. He may have left the store saying goodbye without adding ma'am. Either of those behaviors would have violated the code of conduct for African Americans in Jim Crow, Mississippi. As soon as he leaves, Carolyn Bryant leaves. She's walking towards her car, and Emmett lets out a wolf whistle, which would have been a major violation of that code because of its sexual implications. His cousins know that, and they leave promptly, go home, hope it blows over. It doesn't. A few days later, Roy Bryant, Carolyn Bryant's husband, and J.W. Millam, Bryant's stepbrother, show up at the house where Emmett is staying. They kidnap him, they brutally murder him, and they torture him before that. And then they dump his body in the Tallahatchie River. Now, Bryant and Millam are then later tried and found innocent by this all-white jury. Let the world see what they did to my boy. Mrs. Mamie Till Mobley, Emmett's mother, has Emmett's body flown back to Chicago for an open casket funeral, allows a photographer from Jet Magazine to take the picture of Emmett's battered body. And that picture appears in Jet Magazine as well as other media for that's primarily goes to African American homes. And now I can make that link to the young people of Mississippi, the young freedom fighters. Many of them see that photograph in Jet Magazine, as do many people in the South and throughout the country. And that image has a profound impact on many of them. Here's one primary rich example. Joyce Ladner. She and her sister Dory Ladner were freedom fighters in growing up in around Hattiesburg and then active throughout the state. And here's something that Joyce Ladner said just a couple of years ago. Ours was the Emmett Till generation. No other single incident had a more profound effect on so many people who came into SNCC. We had seen the Jet Magazine cover of Emmett Till's disfigured and bloated face with one eye missing. We were his age and could identify with him. I felt that if they had killed a 14-year-old, they could also kill me or my brothers. We knew that men were lynched, but we'd never known of a child being lynched before. On a profound personal level, this reality had a strong galvanizing effect on all of us. The image is with me still. It became etched in my generation's consciousness. So now let's meet, or for some of you, you already have met Brenda Travis. Brenda Travis is one of the local people, one of those Mississippi children who acted in the name of Emmett Till. And she is a freedom fighter I want young people to know about. Quickly, before I tell the story of Ms. Travis, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page and just talk quickly about two things. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. This is the group growing out of the 1960s sit-in movement, now one of the main organizers in 1961 in the state of Mississippi. Robert Paris Bobmoses. Sadly, we just recently lost Bobmoses. He was one of the main organizers for SNCC in Mississippi. Bobmoses is not from Mississippi. He's from New York. He grew up in Harlem. But he was a disciple of the great Ella Baker. He met her after he was moved by the sit-ins in Greensboro. He came down to Atlanta, met Mrs. Baker, and she sent him out to Alabama and Mississippi and also trained him or schooled him in the local people door-to-door approach to organizing that he brought to Mississippi. He started his organizing in McComb, in the southern part of the state, south of Jackson. And that McComb is also where Brenda Travis is from, and she met Bobmoses. It's 1961 in McComb. At the age of 16, Brenda Travis has become an activist, a part of the movement created by the great Bobmoses. She's going door to door, encouraging people to register to vote. This is what Bobmoses said about her organizing style. She was a young girl, just 16 years old, and had been very active with us in voter registration in McComb. And I mean active. She had walked the streets every day with us in the hot sun. So, what motivates a young 16-year-old girl to become involved in the movement in such a deep way? I will let Ms. Travis explain that to us.
I'm going to go back a little bit because there were things that prompted me to want to do something about our conditions. I go back to Emmett Till, who was brutally murdered. And after viewing or seeing this horrific picture in the Jet magazine, that may have instilled fear in some people, but it instilled anger in me. And it was at that point that I said, no, we've got to do something.
About the murder of Emmett Till, Ms. Travis goes on, it was my motivation to say, one day, one day. So Brenda Travis is organizing, trying to get people to go down to the courthouse to register to vote. And that's not an easy task. It's frustrating her. It's no surprise. People are reluctant to do that. There's so many reasons. Some people who try to register to vote lose their jobs. Others are beaten. Some even murdered. And going down to register, they have to take the literacy test. And in that test, they need to interpret the Mississippi State Constitution, or they need to answer questions like how many bubbles are there in a bar of soap. The entire literacy test process is set up to fail African Americans coming to register to vote. So no wonder they're reluctant, and no wonder Ms. Travis is experiencing that reluctance. So one of the things that happens then, as she's getting frustrated, is there's some new people coming in to McComb from SNCC, people who are supporting a direct action approach to organizing. Direct action being things like sit-ins, or things like marches, or just direct assaults on Jim Crow segregation. And that excites Ms. Travis. So when the call comes at a SNCC rally in August of 1961 for volunteers to engage in direct action, she raises her hand. And the next day, she and two young comrades, one a fellow high school student, another a recent graduate, they head down to the Greyhound Station in McComb. And there's a picture of the Greyhound Station that I took in 2016. You can see it has not been restored in any way, and there's no marker outside. I don't know if things have changed over the last 5 years or so. So the three of them go down to the Greyhound Station to invade the white section of the station. They had worked with members of SNCC who gave them money so they could purchase tickets at the white ticket counter. So what happens when they go in that day? Again, I'll let Brenda Travis let you know.
When we walked into the bus station, it was an extremely, what you could hear prior to us walking in. They saw us walking up, but they had the colored side and they had the white side. And I think they thought that we were going to go to the colored side. So when we walked into the white side, you could hear a pin fall. And they looked in disbelief. And they were very hostile stares. The police department was right around the corner. I didn't see anybody use a phone. But before we could get our tickets in our hands, good, the police were there. But that, with them being there, that probably saved us from the community of white people jumping on us or beating us.
Were they saying anything, or was it just silence?
It was silence initially, and then it was, the stares. As I said, they were looking in disbelief, and then the name calling and stuff, like the N word, which I've given a new meaning or a new name to. I call it the no word. So they call us the no word, and before they could act out their feelings, was there to arrest us. So they took us to jail, to the McComb City Hall, and they booked us. And later that day, they took us down to the Pike County Jail. After they completed their booking process, then they took us down to the Pike County Jail.
So Ms. Travis spends 28 days in jail. She returns to her high school, Berglund High School, and she goes to the principal's office to re-enroll. And the principal tells her that the white superintendent has ordered him to expel her for her civil rights activities. Well, it just so happens that there is a assembly, and word gets around that Ms. Travis has been expelled from school, and students are outraged. And 114 of the students follow Brenda Travis out of the high school in support of her in opposition to her expulsion for civil rights activities. They march down to SNCC headquarters where they organize themselves, make some signs, and then march over to the McComb City Hall. One student walks up to the top of the steps, gets down on his knees and prays, and promptly gets arrested. Second student walks up to the top. She gets down on her knees, prays, and gets arrested. Brenda Travis goes to the top of the steps, and she gets arrested for a second time. Well, pretty soon the police are tired of waiting and then just arrest everybody en masse. The students spend 3 days in jail. When they return to school, they are told they must sign a paper promising not to walk out again. And many of them, about 50 of them, refuse to and end up going to Freedom School with Bobmoses and others from SNCC. Brenda Travis spends 6.5 months in reform school and is later exiled from Mississippi. There's more to the story, but I want to wrap it up and again give Brenda Travis the last word. In 2006, at a commemoration of the walkout in McComb, Ms. Travis shared these thoughts. Maybe something's wrong with my head, but I was feeling prideful. I had the courage to do it, And many people ask, were you afraid? And it was something about the entire experience that I felt no fear. I felt no fear. I guess you would call it much like a vindication. I knew that I was going against the system. I knew I was rebelling against a system that never should have been in place in the first place. So I just felt good. I felt it was doing something positive, that I was doing something positive, and that I was on my journey. I was on the journey that I had vowed to take. That's when my one day came. And I have a chapter devoted to Brenda Travis's story. Brenda Travis has a wonderful memoir, Mississippi's Exiled Daughter, How My Civil Rights Baptism Under Fire Shaped My Life, also published by New South Books. And I encourage you to read that. I am hoping that my book will help to introduce Brenda Travis to young people throughout the country, and that they will be inspired by her story. But here are some other stories that I tell in the book. And I only have time to share a few. There's many that I tell in the book. First one in Jackson, the Tougaloo Nine. On Monday, March 27th, 1961, 9 students from Tougaloo College in Jackson entered the main branch of the Jackson Library, a whites-only library. Some took books from the shelves, sat down and read. Others went over to peruse the card catalog. A librarian came over, asked them, what are you doing here? And told them to leave. And when they did not leave, she called the police. And the police came and arrested them. Here's an amazing picture, a picture of the Tougaloo Nine on the steps of the Jackson Library being arrested. Later at a rally, they were celebrated. Miley Evers, the wife of Medgar Evers, said that it was the Tougaloo Nine who sparked the Mississippi movement. Moving north to Greenwood, Sam Block. And in this picture, to the far left is Bobmoses, and to his right is Sam Block with his elbow on the refrigerator. 23-year-old Sam Block enters the town of Greenwood by himself. And despite facing violence and the initial apathy of the Black community, he, Bobmoses, and others in SNCC built a thriving voter registration movement. And here's another picture that I absolutely love of the Greenwood courthouse and people so patiently waiting in line to register. It's Sam Block laid the foundation for this movement. Greenwood is an incredible, incredible story. Back to Jackson, the Children's March. On May 31st, 1963, 500 students from Jackson's Black high schools walk out to push for an end to the Jim Crow segregation in Jackson. When students march into town, they are arrested. Many put in garbage trucks that had been used that day. They are taken down to makeshift jails on the Mississippi Fairgrounds. The fairgrounds were used in the arresting of many of the young people brought down, used as a makeshift jail. And on the left, those two pictures, you see students at those fairgrounds. The stories I tell in the book come from various parts of the state: Canton, Greenville, Hattiesburg, Louisville, though I do linger for 2 chapters in Greenwood and spend a lot of time in Jackson. The book, I think, is rich in ideas, but ideas I don't necessarily make explicit I could talk about many now, but I want to talk about one as a way to kind of tie things together. And that idea is the notion of psychological change or empowerment that I think is flows throughout the book and is true and reflected in many of the people that I write about. Though there were many social and political changes sought by the freedom fighters, the activists also encouraged a fundamental psychological change within people, a rejection of that inferior sense promulgated by the Jim Crow system. They hoped to move people toward a sense of personal worth and empowerment. And nobody exemplifies that more than Endesha Ida Mae Holland. Endesha Ida Mae Holland, her story starts in a sad way. At 11, she was raped by her white employer. At 13, she becomes a prostitute. She is expelled from her high school. She is arrested several times and ends up in jail. But then at 18, she finds her way to the Greenwood SNCC office. She's from Greenwood. She finds her way to the SNCC office where she meets Bobmoses and other incredible freedom fighters. She slowly is moved by all of them, especially Bobmoses. She begins to become involved in the movement. She goes door to door. She participates in voter registration. She marches. She gets arrested again, this time for good trouble. And she just becomes very deeply involved in SNCC and the movement. Eventually, Endesha Ida Mae Holland goes on and completes her GED, and goes on to complete her doctorate. She earns her doctorate from the University of Minnesota in American Studies, Dr. Endesha Ida Mae Holland. She writes a play and a memoir from the Mississippi Delta. Again, another book that I highly recommend to you. And keeping on the theme of empowerment, the Freedom Schools occurring during the Freedom Summers of 1964. In 1964, young women and men from the North come south to add some fire to the movement. And one thing they did was to teach in the Freedom Schools, an institution set up to provide an alternative education for Black kids. They talked about Black history, which was not studied in the high schools. The young people read Black literature. They read Richard Wright, who was from Mississippi. They read Langston Hughes, both not taught in the public schools they attended, in the schools they attended. And in addition, they were given opportunities for self-expression. In some freedom schools, they created newspapers. And in many freedom schools, the young people wrote poetry. And that's how I'd like to end today. I'd like to share a wonderful poem with you. This poem was written by Sandra Joanne O. from Hattiesburg. The poem is called Who Am I? Who am I? Let me see. Am I a dog? Or am I a bee? Am I a maniac who's out of her mind? I think I know, and I'll tell you, I'm not the girl I used to be. Who am I? I have to know, so I may tell it wherever I go. I'll tell it to men of all the land. I'll tell it to kids who shake my hand, that I am free, and it shows to everyone over all the land. Who am I? I'll tell you now. I'll have to find words, but I'll tell it somehow. I am a Negro who fought her best to earn her freedom and deserves to rest. So do as I did, and you'll be free. Just don't hit back, and you'll win your rest. There's one frustrating thing about the title, In the Name of Emmett Till, How the Children of the Mississippi Freedom Struggle Showed Us Tomorrow. The children of Mississippi showed us tomorrow and even moved us toward tomorrow. But we have yet to arrive at that tomorrow. I am hoping that by finding out about what these amazing young people from Mississippi did, the young people of today and all of us will hear this earlier generation and complete the work they started. Thank you for your kind attention, and I'm looking forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you, Bob. That was great. We do have both comments and questions.
Wonderful.
In fact, I'll start with one that can prompt a question. Will Kelly says, thank you for helping Mrs. Travis tell her story as a mosaic of the many bits and pieces that make up our history. Strong across the state of Mississippi. Let's bring it all together. Will Kelly is also working on a documentary film about George Raymond, who is mentioned in your book.
Yes.
Maybe say a few words about Raymond in your book. You bring him in as a freedom rider, but his story is really a long one and a sad one.
It is, and I listened to the History is Lunch session where the documentary was shown, and I was so excited by that. And I also had visited the Freedom House in Canton.
Yes.
At Glen Cotton. So I'm so excited that this movie is being made. George Raymond is another, like Brenda Travis, who I want young people to know about. He was involved, in the freedom rides. He came from New Orleans. He was he participated in the sit-ins in the lunch counter in Jackson, and then he went on, like Sam Block, to organize in Canton a voter registration movement. And he worked there with Ann Moody, Annie Devine, and he is somebody that people need to know about. So thank you for making that documentary.
Vicki Roberts Ratliff asks, do you have any mention of the Fulton Chapel student protest on February 25th, 1970 at the University of Mississippi in your work?
I don't know anything about that. I guess it's one of the wonderful things about this project is things keep jumping up, and I hope I'll have access to that, your comment later, because I want to find out more about that. I pretty much only go up to 1964.
Yeah. So the book is aimed at young adults. One of the quotes that you mention in the book is from Tougaloo Professor John Salter. He would ask his students, what role should young people play in solving the problems that face their world? And it struck me that might sort of be what you had in mind when you wrote this book.
That's right. Could you repeat that again? Repeat Dr. Salter's question.
What role should young people play in solving the problems that face their world?
Yeah, and that yes, and like Dr. Salter, I taught high school. I actually continue to teach. I do teach a course on the civil rights movement, and both teaching, but in particular that course on the civil rights movement, and then now in the book, I do want people to take in these stories and ask questions about themselves and how they see their role in the world, what they're going to do. In the civil rights movement course, we just encounter all of these people who, like the people I write about in the book, are just leaping out of the Jim Crow environment they live in and respond. So I'm hoping that young people will do that, will will think in terms of what can I do?
And I think that for people who were too young to have experienced the segregation firsthand in those ways, it can be confusing almost. I mean, it manifested itself in such tangled scenarios at times. For instance, in Jackson, black people were allowed to purchase tickets and visit the zoo, but they could not have a seat on benches there. Could you maybe say a few words about Amos Brown, who was one of the young people that you profile, and what he did with regard to the zoo?
That's right. He led a sit-in the zoo. It at the time was not successful. The logic of the time was, and I believe it was maybe the mayor who said that we believe that there's no problems if black people and white people are at the zoo together, but problems occur when they sit down together on a bench. And I'm sure Reverend Brown would see that as something absurd and respond to it. So he led that sit-in and at the Jackson Zoo, correct?
And what was I love the ultimate resolution of that.
Right, they took the benches down.
Right, yeah. No one will sit.
That's right.
Which, I mean, was the strategy that Mayor Thompson and city leaders took when the issue of integrating the public swimming pools came about a few years after that as well. You refer to him as Reverend Brown, and that's because of what his career has been following that. How many of the people that you wrote about in this book were you able to meet, to correspond with, or communicate with directly?
I'm sorry to say I really haven't communicated much with any of them. I had some contacts with Joyce Ladner, which were really nice, but I haven't had much. When I was in Mississippi many years ago, I did get a chance to meet Hollis Muhammad, and that was, I really appreciated that opportunity to get to know him. I have not spoken with him since, but I maybe through the book coming out, I will make some connections with people.
Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah. And
Reverend Brown is now and has been a minister in San Francisco for many, many years.
And you really trace the genesis of this book project to a conference that you attended here at Jackson State, funded by the NEH in, was it 2014?
That's correct. Yes. And it's where I met Dr. Leslie Burrell Mecklemore, who wrote the foreword to the book.
Right.
And that was, I got to spend 3 weeks in Jackson. It was quite a great time being on Jackson State's campus. We traveled in the Delta. We went to Greenwood. We went to Clarksdale. We went to Money and saw Bryant's grocery store. So that was great. We were introduced to both scholars and activists. We met Dave Dennis. We met John Dittmer, who had written the book Local People. But it was a wonderful, wonderful experience, yes.
You had about the best tour guide you could ask for on that, Mr. Charles McLaurin.
I forgot to mention him. That was unbelievable to have him. He was our guide through the Delta, and I didn't know much about him while he was doing it.
Right.
And so when I came home and started to read more, it was like, wow, what a person.
Right. There for so much of it. Sarah Campbell asks, what did you find out about the relationships of these young people with their older family members, and how did they navigate those relationships?
I got a sense of that from a few of the people within their families. I know I just heard Brenda Travis talk about this, but she talked about the day she went to the sit-in that she didn't want to tell her, she didn't want to lie to her mother or tell her. And everything she talked about was about a tightness and a support from her mother. That was the message I got from Miss Travis. The other person I think about is June Johnson, who in Greenwood, June Johnson became enamored of the folks from SNCC who had come to Greenwood to organize, Sam Block and Bobmoses. And she apparently had to sneak out of her house. She didn't want to let her mother know she was involved in the movement. She had gotten the message from her mom was, you don't get involved in the movement. She was also, June Johnson's mother was also concerned with losing her job. But the more June got involved with the movement, and then when June went to Winona and had that horrible experience where she was beaten along with Fannie Lou Hamer, her mother came up and it sounds like in the process was just moved by June Johnson's involvement, and she became active with SNCC. She became apparently cooked for many of the SNCC people.
Yeah.
There was also, in thinking about this some more, in Greenwood, Silas McGee, and his mom was 100% behind him. So, I read some of the people about that experience with their parents and got some sense of it. I'd love to know more about that.
Speaking of familial relationships and thinking about it from a parent's perspective, so many of the people that you write about, Brenda Travis, Johnny Frazier, Hezekiah Watkins, more of them, were all separated from their families, and their families did not know what had happened to them or where their children were on so many occasions throughout the book.
That's right. That's right. To me, the most the tragic one is when Brenda Travis was sent to the reform school. They didn't let her mother know where she was, and her mother, I forget how many weeks it was before her mother found out about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. And the others, they were time separated when June Johnson was in Winona and had that horrible event. Her mother, for a while, did not know what was going on. And John Frazier, the same. He was not able to contact anybody. Eventually, he got word to Medgar Evers, and so people came for him.
We have a question from Bill Justice, who says, you said that you teach these concepts in your classes. Are you planning to work to develop a more broadly available curriculum built around your work? There are a lot of place-based opportunities in Mississippi. I bet there are place-based opportunities like this in every community in the country. Finding those could be an important part of the curriculum.
That's wonderful. I thank you for, you're actually putting that idea in my head, surprisingly, since I'm coming out of education. I was an education professor, and maybe I've stepped out of that now as a writer, but that notion of creating a curriculum is a wonderful idea. I had not thought about that, and I would be so pleased if this book were taught in schools.
Yeah.
So that is an idea, a way to spend my time. I've been deeply involved in the writing of another book, so that's my excuse for not thinking of it. But thank you for putting that idea in my head.
Deirdre Payne says, Thank you for focusing on the civil rights education of young people. This is critical to understanding democracy in 20th century America. I'm glad to see that you are making this available throughout the nation. It is not a Mississippi story only. It is an American story that needs telling at that level of understanding.
Absolutely. It is an American story. And it's a story I think of in terms of, we go back to the founders and the creation of the democracy and its beauty and imperfection. And one of the beauties of the democracy is it's a work in progress, still a work in progress.
Right.
And clearly a work in progress at the time of the civil rights movement and with these young people. So I look at people like Brenda Travis, John Fraser, Hezekiah Watkins. They are continuing the work of the founders. So it's part of the democratic story, yes.
The young people in your book also learned the power of economics through store boycotts and other strategies. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what happened with the Mississippi State Fair. The first week of the fair was reserved for whites only, leaving just a few days for blacks to attend.
Right. The segregated Mississippi Fair every year occurred, and it was the North Jackson Youth Council of the NAACP, Perlina Lewis. They had seen that and took that as a target, a place that they wanted to address. So they boycotted. They encouraged the black community or anybody to boycott the fair, but in particular to boycott the African American segment of the fair. They did that in October and were very successful. October of 1961.
Right.
And again in, I believe, 1962.
That's right.
And they were successful both times. And then they went on to have a boycott of stores in Jackson and created all of these strategies for doing that, ways to communicate with the community to make the boycott successful.
One thing that you mentioned in the book as well that we didn't really get a chance to talk about today is the way that nonviolence was used strategically, and also how nonviolence was not practiced by everyone in the Mississippi movement. Maybe a few words about that.
Sure. I have to mention Dave Dennis because he kept popping up in the book for me. It seemed like every time there was an event, Dave Dennis was there doing workshops on nonviolence. He was from CORE. And so there was clearly an emphasis with training people in nonviolence in the movement. But the movement was not completely nonviolent. And for most of the people I talk about, nonviolence was a strong element. But in Canton in particular, George Raymond from CORE worked with C.O. Chin, who did not believe in nonviolence. He would show up at the rallies that George Raymond would organize with a rifle. And there's a story that in the book, and I just heard Dave Dennis tell again, about going and talking to Mr. Chin and asking him about, well, this is a nonviolent movement. And Mr. Chin saying to him, well, I understand that, but these are my people, and I'm going to protect them, and that's what I'm going to do. And Dave Dennis said, thank you, sir, something like that, and went back in. So the movement with the young people was primarily nonviolent, but there was aspects of the movement that was not.
I find it ironic in multiple passages in the book as well that a tactic used by Medgar Evers when a black student would be expelled from their high school, was to threaten to try and have that black student admitted to the local white school to get them readmitted to their own school.
Right. He was that. Thank you for mentioning Medgar Evers. I want to make sure that I say something about him. He hovers over the book in many ways.
Yeah.
He connected with people like John Fraser and Amos Brown and many people, the Ladner sisters, and he loved these youth councils and inspired the young people. And Medgar Evers, like Bobmoses, is one of those people that isn't really studied in schools and is so important, and he is central to the movement. And he's one of the reasons he's not is because he didn't lead these big marches. He worked one-to-one with people. And people, and I quote people in the book, John Fraser, people talk about him almost like he was a father to them.
Right.
But he sounded like just an amazing person.
Deirdre Payne notes that Mr. C.O. Chin died over the last year as well. So.
Thank you. I had not been following that, and that again is sad to hear, and it's another reason why these stories need to be told. And first of all, they need to be told by the people who went through them. But listening to Brenda Travis on History is Lunch is just so wonderful. So we need more of those stories. I'm sad to hear that.
Well, and that's a nice segue to recommend for folks the great videos that you showed with Ms. Travis are part of a whole series. There's a lot more video footage that's available for folks to watch free online.
That's right. The McComb students from McComb interviewed her, and they were wonderful. They're great.
And so if anybody wants to just search for that, I think you can come up with it pretty
Telling
easily.
Their story. It's called Telling Their Stories.
Right. Well, we have come to the top of another hour. We are delighted that you've been able to come to us remotely. It has been one of the few benefits of the resurgent COVID-19 virus is that we've been able to have folks who might not ordinarily be able to make it to Jackson, Mississippi at noon on a Wednesday to talk to us for History is Lunch. The book is just published. Congratulations on that. You can find copies of it at better bookstores everywhere. Thank you all for tuning in and watching today. Remember to tune in next week for Emma Falwell and Robert Mayer. Thank you so much. We look forward to working with you again in the future.
I want to return to Jackson. Thank you.